So welcome everyone. Welcome to the event that we are having tonight, where we are looking at reggae music, enslavement, abolition, reparations. Why we are doing this is that, as we all know, reggae music is widely accepted as contributing to international discourses on issues that range from peace, love, and harmony to resistance and fighting oppression. The genre also has very important things to say about enslavement, abolition, and reparations. To help us unpack some of these issues, we've got a absolutely brilliant panel. We've got Alex Otieno, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Arcadia University and Associate Dean for the College of Arts and Science. And we've also got Cecil Gutzmore, who is a community activist and a historian and has done a lot of work around Black history. And we've also got Kwaku, who is a historiological musicologist and author of Brent Black Music History Project Book and CD. To proceed is each of the speakers will take it in turn to introduce themselves and say briefly how they came to reggae music before we go to the substantive issues. Thank you. So we start with you, Cecil.
Okay, thank you very much, my brother. It's good to be with you, and I thank you and Brother Kwaku for the invitation. I'm happy to be amongst my fellow Africans and to be speaking on reggae music, enslavement, abolition, and I think resistance or something, reparations too, all of which reggae speaks about. My own encounter, I'm actually in my late 70s. I was born in Jamaica, in rural Jamaica, a little place called Buff Bay. And in the 50s, when I grew up there, reggae was beginning to emerge. The town had jukeboxes on which we heard American music and the beginnings of Jamaican music, the music of Jamaica that became reggae. In addition to having jukeboxes at various points in the town, people organized dances and big sound systems, and the biggest of sound systems came occasionally to the town. And one of the things about them is that they had some wonderful speakers that they used to put very high up, and they made enough noise for everybody in the town virtually to hear what was going on. In addition to that, there was some, not much of the early Jamaican music, but some Jamaican music on local radio. There was at least 3 different radio stations, and one heard the music in that way. So in my pre-teens and teens, I came here at about 17, I was already steeped in the emerging genre that comes to be called reggae. So it's in my blood, if you like, by virtue of where and how I grew up and what I grew up with. So having said that, I think that this session is really, it seems to me, objectively about the spiritual, emotional, and political ideological power of reggae lyrics particularly. And the depth, it's about the depth of the way it reaches into and the weight of its touch on some major human concerns. So they include oppression, war, enslavement, freedom. All of that is embraced in a very powerful way in reggae lyrics. And that, I think, is what gives reggae its planetary not quite universal appeal. Of course, we don't know what happens outside our planet, so we can't say that's really universal. Although reggae musicians are very convinced about that, and the number of times the word universal turns up in our lyrics is somebody should make a study of that, because it's actually quite interesting. But we're talking about a planetary impact, and my own belief is that that power that reggae generates in its lyrics is a function of some elements that are uniquely combined within it. And the first of these seems to me to be the fact that Jamaica is a Protestant country, and that we had, in a way, rammed down our throats, but it wasn't all that painful, the King James Version of the Bible, which is a very powerful spiritual as well as cultural entity. And a person like me, who was a Baptist, but Jamaica is like, it's not a Catholic country. And it meant that you got the Bible in Sunday school, in the morning service, in the evening service, and at other events during the week. So you got a lot of the Bible. And that's actually a very powerful source of the imagery. All of the stuff about Rome, the anti-Roman stuff, all of the stuff about Babylon and the anti-Babylonian stuff is generated from the way in which that stuff lodges in our head as a result of the way in which we were raised. Now, I'm not necessarily putting the argument that in that reggae is uniquely powerful. I think it is uniquely powerful, but it's not alone in being powerful. Nobody who hears Stevie Wonder or Marvin Gaye or Fela Kuti or Christy Moore from Ireland can believe that reggae is alone in having this global reach, because it's not true. But what is true is that it does have a remarkable, powerful global reach, and for the reason that I've already given. Behind the King James Version is an extraordinary translator, a man called William Tyndale, and the translators of what became the King James Version, the authorized version, simply ripped off King Tyndale's version. They don't acknowledge it, but that's what happens. And Tyndale really was a remarkable translator. So that's what we grew up on. Now, so there's that. There's the English language, which combines, and it's another feature inside of reggae is the power of what people call Jamaican patois. It's one of the Atlantic Creoles, and it's extraordinarily powerful. It's extraordinarily evocative, and if it has available to it, in addition to the African mythology and African worldview, if it also has that enriched by the stuff that comes to us from Romans and in the Bible, or from Revelation in the Bible, you are in the presence of something that's likely to be extraordinarily powerful. And then we have an experience, which is an experience of oppression that's gone through phases. Conquest, where they wiped out the initial people, and we sing about that, you know. What about the Arawak Indians and the few black men who was on here before Columbus arrived, and the fact that the black people are still there, but the Arawaks have gone, and so on. So we think about that, sing about that, and then we sing about enslavement. And enough of our performers, and it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with classical reggae. Incidentally, I don't believe in the distinction between reggae and dancehall. I know what people are talking about when they say classic reggae, and it's very powerful and specific. But the difference between classic reggae and dancehall isn't that the one is slack and confused and violent, and the other wholly righteous, and so on. In fact, in classic reggae, as in dance hall, you have two elements combined. You have the sacred and the profane. You have the worldly and the ungodly, or the godly and the ungodly, and so on. And that applies to everything that happened. I mean, they date kind of the end of classical reggae from Marley's passing in maybe 81, and the arrival of Edward Seaga into government in Jamaica. It's an important break, but it doesn't actually change the music. The contents are the same. And if you listen to Yellow Man and other so-called dancehall artists, you will see that they're engaged with exactly the same subject matter, whether it's war, peace, love, freedom, the need for us to liberate ourselves. All of those are themes that are systemically, powerfully, effectively dealt with across the board in reggae. And I didn't hear it happen, but I suggested that we should play in, as we opened, a piece by Anthony B, which is, what did I say it was called? It's about reparations. And effectively, it talks about, it's called Damage. And what it talks about is the extent to which our encounter with the white world, with the racist white world, involved real wickedness and suffering, that the apology cannot undo that, and that everything that they own is generated by the labor of ancestors and our own labor in this time. If you step outside the Caribbean, but you don't have to, you know, they're the ones who came and ripped off the bauxite, and they're ripping off everything on the continental homeland. They're ripping off Guyanese oil and deceiving Guyanese about what they will get for it, and so on. So all of that and more is analyzed, celebrated, talked about, bigged up, however you want to put it, in reggae lyrics. And finally, the issue of liberation. It's a key theme in our music, whether we have Bob Marley talking about everywhere is war until there is freedom and equality. We have Buju Banton talking about the walk down Redemption Street and the liberation at the end of that, and so it goes on. And same Anthony B has a wonderful song, not classic reggae at all, but magnificent, something called Fire Upon Rome. And that imagery, that I repeat, comes from the New Testament, the end of the Old Testament, some of those powerful books towards the end of the Bible that as I say, we imbibe. You know, it's there, and the fact that we have a duty, and some people even think that God will help us to do it, but I think we'll have to get around to doing it ourselves. And reggae lyrics, whether classic or dance hall, focuses very deeply and inspiringly on all of those matters for those reasons, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Cecil. I've got quite a few questions, but we'll come to them at the end.
Yes.
So for those who are listening in, if you've got questions as well, if you put them in the chat, we'll come back to you at the relevant time. And then we go to Alex.
Thank you, Ambrose, and thank you, Cecil, for getting us started and for sharing the history of reggae. And I'm a little bit envious that my path to reggae was not as immersive. I wasn't deeply embedded in it as such. I relied on the radio as a youngster, about age, when I say 9, 10, 11. There was a radio show that would come on the Kenyan Broadcasting Corporation. Back then, it was called The Voice of Kenya. And it came up once a week on a Saturday. And so that's how I sort of originally started, and also listening to reggae music from in my neighborhood and at home. So that was my beginning. And then over time, as I grew up, listened on my own and found meaning through reggae. And subsequently, as an adult and as a scholar, I've engaged in studying reggae, both as a way to recuperate memory and history, but also as a way of grappling with the everyday concerns, both, as you correctly pointed out, the issues of war and justice and freedom and enslavement and abolition and resistance. So that's my sort of short history with reggae. I've recently been particularly interested in dub poetry, so the work of Linton Kwesi Johnson and to some extent Tabaruka, and find particular affinity with the music, and especially following.
We're learning about reggae.
Following the UNESCO proclamation of reggae as an intangible world heritage in 2018, after the Jamaican government sort of proposed this recognition. With regard to issues of enslavement, abolition, and reparation, I've recently been listening to Mozambican musician Ras Haitrim, the name Ras and then H-A-I-T-R-M, and he's been collaborating with the Firehouse Crew from Jamaica. So he visited Jamaica in 2016 and established a relationship with the brothers there. And he has a song, and actually the video of it would probably be worthwhile watching as part of this session, because he has a video. It's on his album, Go Tell the World is the album. And track 6 is Do You Remember? And track 6 is available on YouTube. Do You Remember Ras Haitrim? And he essentially is parading, I believe it's in Portugal, but he could be somewhere else, and is parading barefoot with bare-chested and in chains, and singing repeatedly, do you remember the days of slavery? Do you remember the days of slavery? I do, I do, I do. And everybody's looking at him because he's on the street in the middle of the day. So the imagery itself, so which kind of speaks to both the lyrics and the imagery of reggae, and the imagery, he uses images from enslavement in the US, including cases where there were lynchings. So he embeds that in this particular song. Of course, when we talk about slavery, my initial exposure, having grown up in Kenya, wasn't necessarily slavery, wasn't part of what we talked about. We were more preoccupied with independence from the colonialists, but encountering Burning Spear allowed me to sort of explore, do you remember the days of slavery, which is another sort of track that relates to this. And if we go back to Bob Marley's Redemption Song is another one where enslavement and slavery comes in. And to some extent, one could also draw on Peter Tosh, Mama Africa, and you see sort of embedded in the song lyrics about sort of being taken away or wanting to return. So that sort of journey of return and being sort of snatched away is available there. I wanted to sort of conclude by sort of referring to reparation. And in reparation, there's a Tanzanian musician, reggae musician from Tanzania called Ras Gambo. And Ras Gambo has a video that is also available on YouTube that addresses a reparation and is actually kind of demanding reparation. Ras Hytrim also has another song on reparation. And it's particularly unique for me because these are African reggae musicians who are singing about reparation and demanding reparation. Normally, so Jamaicans and people in the Caribbean, Africans in the diaspora or people of African descent who are born and raised in the Caribbean or in the US, it connects with their own histories, but this sort of shows that connection. Ambrose, earlier on, you are alluding to this sort of international relations, sort of complicating and demonstrating how we are both related as a people and connected, and our histories are linked, even though we can think of them as separate. So I will end there for now, and we'll be looking forward to further conversation.
Thank you very much, Alex. And we go to you, Kwaku.
Goodness. Hi, good evening. Thanks a lot. It's been interesting. Obviously, we're supposed to have a conversation. So, but since people have been a bit more, what should I say? They said much more than I thought for the introduction. So I think I'll follow suit. Well, my name is Kwaku. I was born in the UK. I did live in Ghana for quite a while. And I think it was last year, or the year before, I did a playlist, Spotify playlist for Trojan Records. So I had to go through their archives and have a theme around it. And in doing so, I sort of wrote liner notes. Really, that was the first time I sort of really spoken about myself to some extent. Even though I'm out in the public, my private life is quite private to some extent. But in that liner notes, I sort of wrote about my first engagement with reggae. So I think I will rewind some of that. And if you go onto Spotify, I'm sure you find it. Also, I publish it elsewhere. So basically, I think my recollection of what we term reggae, and remember, reggae is a catch-all phrase that covers from rather, Cecil was talking about dancehall, rocksteady, all those things really come under that catch-all phrase, which is reggae. So my earliest recollection of anything that could be branded reggae was in Ghana, and this would have been the late 1960s. And it varies from things like the crazy things like the Beatles making an attempt at reggae, which was a song called Obladi Oblada, to Johnny Nash was quite heavy in those days. So we're looking at 68, 69. Johnny Nash, what is new? He went to Jamaica and recorded in Jamaica, but I suppose the anorak to say it wasn't reggae, it was rocksteady in that period. It's much more rocksteady. So you're looking at things like Cupid and Hold Me Tight. Then a song that is etched in my mind. I will come to the subject, but I'm giving you a bit of background because you say you want an introduction. So I'm giving a bit of a background. A song that for some reason is etched in my mind is Angel of the Night, Angel of the Morning. And initially, I wasn't quite sure who sang it. I just knew it was a female artist. Remember, just like Alex was talking about his exposure to music. In Ghana, my exposure would have been the radio. And at that time, we only had one radio, the national radio. So often it was a big hit from Europe or really Britain that translated onto the main radio station. So I'm thinking of this Angel of the Morning. And now when I was doing the Trojan thing, I discovered an artist called Yoya Landis. So it's probably what I heard because it was a bit reggae-fied. And the original Angel of the Morning is not a reggae song. So I come to the UK in 1970 and I was around Labrador, which is where Cecil is based. And I was seeing these people with ghetto blasters. And to me on the street, and I have to say that I found it uncouth. And I found it, it was so ghetto. So ghetto. Why would you play? And no wonder they call it ghetto blasters on the streets. And so it really put me off reggae. I thought reggae, and I mean, Cecil bear this. Even in Jamaica, there's uptown and downtown. And when interesting, when you call the Jamaican High Commission in London and they put you on hold, the hold music is Bob Marley reggae. But believe me, in the 60s, they were not like reggae was not popular. Jamaicans, in fact, was it Marley Cecil that said, bring me these Rasta people, dead or alive? That Bustamante, I think, was the one that said that. Reggae, Jamaicans, Rastafarians, they were not alike. And so I'm saying, even in Jamaica, there was a prejudice. So please excuse me if I was prejudiced against reggae, because I found it to be very uncouth, my initial experience. But let's jump into the mid-70s. In the mid-70s, I worked for a while at Virgin Records, the distribution. I think it was CBS, WEA, and maybe one other company. But they happened to distribute the records of Virgin Records. And at that time, Virgin became one of the most prolific labels in terms of releasing reggae. They went to Jamaica and signed almost everyone. So if I can look at my notes in here, Mighty Diamonds, Kid Hudson, Johnny Clark, they happy to touch because America, CBS released Legalize It, but they didn't release in the UK. So Virgin picked that up. So they had Peter Tosh Legalize It. So Euro, Iro, they had all these people. So you had what you call roots and culture. You also had MCs like Euro and stuff. And because you could buy the album for £1 and they retail for £3, but because we worked in the distribution depot, we could buy for £1. I just bought so many albums. And also, this is important. I had time to listen to albums more than once. Today, I'm so busy that even if I have an album to review, I listen to it maybe once. I'll be surprised if I can listen to it a second time because there's just no time. But I knew those albums in and out because I had time to re-listen to them. So in the 70s, and actually look at the little research I did, and I wanted to do research based on albums that I knew rather than just go on the internet. It tends to be that all those roots and culture albums were around 76, 78. That's where these guys were talking about Africa. Certainly Marcus Garvey, Burning Spear. That was the first one. I remember seeing it in the record shop. Obviously, we're talking about vinyl, so it's a 12-inch artifact. And I saw this Marcus Garvey. I didn't know much about Marcus Garvey. And then you start hearing it on radio. And remember, in the UK, we started getting pirate stations because BBC, again, was the main radio station, and it wasn't playing that type of stuff. So pirate stations were coming on the scene. So I think the only place where I could have heard reggae, because I didn't go to clubs, by the way, I didn't go to clubs, and I don't really remember going to specialist record shops. I'll go to the main ones, which would be Virgin, HMV. So it had to be something that was on a big label that had distribution into the big shops. So if I didn't get it from the distribution, then I'll go to a big shop like HMV or Virgin, which was a retailer as well, and get these albums. So I'm just gonna list some of the stuff that I remember. Certainly, Aswad was a UK band, and their first album was called Aswad. That came in '76. But the track that sticks in my mind all these years is not the singles, but a track called Back to Africa. So that's an album track speaking, because now a lot of our African Caribbean young people embrace Rastafarism at this time. If you see the photos, you see their locks are quite short because they were just getting into it. They were very disenfranchised. Remember, I'm a continental African, so my experience is slightly different. In terms of class, I won't say I was working class, so I had a different experience. Most of our African Caribbean people were working class. They were disenfranchised at the cold face of hardship in terms of all the social indices, housing, employment, or whatever. So Rastafarism spoke to them. And what were the tenets of Rastafarism, apart from the spiritual one? It had the social one, which was an affinity to Africa. They made African Caribbeans understand that they were African. And I'll just highlight this album. This album is called A Place Called Africa. Junior Biles did it. Well, the title track is by Junior Biles. But if I see people like Alton Ellis, people who sang love songs and blah, 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 speaking about being African, I'm saying the power of roots and culture was not just for typical roots and culture people. People who sang love songs could go into roots and culture, because I think roots and culture was so powerful that people realized that, look, we are in Babylon. Babylon is another word they used to use. Babylon is the West, the West. And so they thought their redemption would be in Africa. So the locks, that's why it's called dread against the system, really as harsh as it can be. And a lot of songs we're talking about back to Africa. Obviously, since I do British Black music, at least I want to highlight one token British artist, which is Aswa, back to Africa. Then Third World was an act that I really waited for their album for a long time. The first album was called Third World, on which they had a haunting version of Slavery Days. A haunting version, I think it was about 7 minutes, very moody, atmospheric version of Slavery Days. But their second album was called 1865. And fair enough, I didn't understand the significance then. It's only recently, since I've been doing history, that I understand what 1865 meant, even though you see, the point is that, even let me tell you about Burning Spear. People hear a lot about Marcus Garvey, but actually when you check it, he doesn't say that much about Marcus Garvey. He repeats Marcus Garvey's name. So I think what it is a signal for you to go further and learn about Marcus Garvey, because you're not going to learn a lot about Marcus Garvey just by listening to the albums. He talks about a lot of stuff. So this 1865, 96 Degrees in the Shade, that was the title track, 1976 by Third World. And that is talking about the Moran-Bay uprisings, yeah? So that is, we're talking about slavery. So this is people rebelling against enslavement or being in Babylon, as they say. So that was powerful. Somebody mentioned Redemption Song. Obviously, yeah, I mean, that stands out. And I'll just say, I think in 2020, I helped Nubian Jack. They unveiled a plaque in a park in South London called Crystal Palace. And this venue is called Crystal Palace Bowl, where a lot of bands used to play. And I think the last gig that Bob Marley and the Wailers played was there in 1980. And you know what? It was sundown. They played for a long time, and they had finished, and people were leaving. Then just him, along with an acoustic guitar, played Redemption Song. Some people left. Some people probably came back. So they unveiled this plaque to Bob Marley and the Wailers as the place that British people heard Redemption Song for the first time. I think it's Alex, if I'm mispronouncing him, sorry. He talked a bit about that, so I'm not going to go there. What else do I want to talk about? Certainly, what's his name? Joseph Hill, culture, too long in slavery. So what's his name? Cecil said, I mean, slavery, all those things, reparations, this roots and culture people, that's standard for them. So if you listen to any of those roots and culture acts from the mid-70s to maybe the early 80s, you get it. So I mean, I've just made a note of too long in slavery. Certainly, it speaks to Burning Spear, Marcus Garvey, Slavery Days. Now, a track that speaks about going back to Africa, Fred Locke's Black Star Liners. It alludes to, obviously, Marcus Garvey and the UNI's Black Star Liners. But what did it say? 7 miles of Black Star Liners coming in the harbor. 7 miles. So it's not just one ship, because Black Star Line, Marcus Garvey didn't have many ships. I think about 3 or 4 at the most. But 7 miles of Black Star Liners coming to take them back for repatriation. Even a guy like Dennis Brown, fantastic singer-songwriter, he could sing about love songs 1 minute. The next minute, he'll flip it and still be authentic, singing roots and culture stuff. So he's got a song called Repatriation that came out in 78. But I think I just want to go back to this song, A Place Called Africa by Junior Biles. That was produced by Lee Perry. So my people, I think Rastafarism help our African Caribbean brothers, particularly those in Jamaica, to connect with Africa. Because you think it's obvious because they look like this, but a lot of them, in fact, up to now, some of them are still disengaged with Africa. Some of them do not even know about Marcus Garvey in the 21st century. I think Kwaku is done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kwaku. Yeah, so from the contributions that we've had so far, we've got a lot to look at, to unpack. There's religion, there's colonialism, there's class, uptown, downtown. But I suppose if we roll back a little bit and look at enslavement itself, what are we talking about when we talk about enslavement, and also why should we talk about it? I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll go first because probably it's I'll have a different take since I'm continental rather than diaspora African. As a continental African, we probably would not understand the trauma that our diasporan brothers and sisters have gone through. And I wrote an article for a newspaper called Weekly Gleaner about a month or so ago. And I said that music, food, and films, continental African music, primarily Afrobeats, Nollywood films, and food, jollof, is bringing continental Africans and diasporan Africans a bit closer. Because these days I go to African Caribbean things, particularly Jamaican things, and they've got jollof on the menu. So they are into Afrobeats. Because in the UK, Afrobeats have taken over from reggae. On radio, in the clubs, on the live circuits. I hear Nollywood films are popular in the Caribbean. So where am I going with this? I sort of lost my train of thought because yes. So I think I do work. No, there's still a divide, even though we're getting closer, there's still a divide. There are a lot of continental Africans who have not really engaged with people of African Caribbean culture. It's getting closer, but there's still a big divide. I'm one of those few people that is comfortable being in an continental African space and being in an African Caribbean space, but it's not that common. Though I'm saying we're getting closer, I sort of, like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm saying both states exist. We're getting closer, but there's still a divide. So enslavement, coming from a continental African point of view, and my proximity to African Caribbeans is that it's part of their psyche, it's a trauma that is in their DNA. So, I mean, if they're thinking about it, they need to think about it to release what they've gone through, which continental Africans would never understand. Just like a man would never understand what a woman goes through in childbirth. You can empathize with your wife, but you never understand what a woman goes through. So I think maybe I should give the floor to Brother Cecil to respond to the importance of enslavement in terms of the culture. You need to unmute. Brother Cecil, you need to unmute.
Yeah, thanks for that. As it happens, I think that enslavement is two things in the world in which we live. Slavery as a notion turns up in almost everybody's imagination as the worst form of human oppression. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, slavery turns up as the worst form of human exploitation. And so you don't actually need to have been through enslavement in any recent time as we diasporans have to know what diasporans are talking about in music when we say or speak to a specific experience, because everybody has that metaphor in their heads as something awful. Yeah. So I don't think that the fact that continental Africans generally didn't go through slavery, or that Europeans didn't go through slavery in any recent time or in anything like the same way, means that they're actually distant from us, African Americans, in the broadest sense, talking about that. And if it's talked about in the rich language of oppression that the King James Version provides, it's actually, as I think I was saying right at the start, a universal rendition of an experience. And that seems to me to be why reggae has gone everywhere. I agree with you that no genre of music stays on top forever. It's generational. It's a whole range of other things that generate what happens. But I remember being once in Namibia and going into a park. I was down there for a conference of some kind. I met a youth, and he knew the whole Jamaica dance hall scene and was able to talk to me about Butcher Banton. This is early 2000s, right? So that stuff really has got everywhere. The extent to which, for example, Japanese listen to reggae and understand it, and the extent to which, combined with Rastafari, some of them actually migrated to Jamaica. There's a Rastafari center in Jamaica. It's actually owned by the Marleys, where Japanese are living there, Japanese Rastafari. So what we're talking about, given the power of slavery as metaphor, enslavement as metaphor, and given the power of the biblically derived imagery of Babylon and Rome and fire upon Rome, and that kind of stuff, it's reached much further than people who have, you know, the specific experience of that form of oppression. Now, you touched on a lot of this, but it matters that what reggae is dealing with is not just the oppression that enslavement represents, but other and subsequent forms of oppression. And so you touch on Aswad, but there's a whole generation of African Caribbean, sometimes a mixture actually of West African and Caribbean young people who got, as you correctly say, into Africa via reggae and via Rastafari, and sometimes suffered the consequences. In Birmingham, for example, a whole generation of young people effectively went over to Rastafari and got very badly battered by the police in that city because they were criminalized in terms of their locks and their alleged participation in street robberies and whatever. And this gave the local police force carte blanche for systemic brutality. So the key, it seems to me, and this is pure repetition, to understanding the worldwide power of reggae is that it speaks to real oppression, which is not unique to us. It speaks to slavery, which is non-unique because of the universality of the acceptance of the notion of slavery as the worst form of oppression. And then in the Jamaican version, it gets put into the language of the Bible. So so people talk about fire upon Rome and all of that. And everybody worldwide has the possibility of understanding what is being talked about and this biblical symbol of oppression and degeneration and so on and so forth. So
thank you, Cecil. Thank you. Alex, I don't know if.
Yeah, sure. What I might add is the more contemporary musicians. So Jaleel, for instance, or Busy Signal, who sing about modern day slavery. So that enslavement, going back to what Cecil was saying, that it's not just the historic form. Absolutely, we are referring to the centuries of robbing people and putting them in ships and exploiting them and holding them in chattel slavery without any rights. But the forms of oppression that we see today in multiple ways, whether it's sort of work that is unrewarding, that is exploitative. And to the larger issue of slavery itself, we often think about slavery as being confined to people who were transported from the African continent and taken to either the Americas, so places like that. But in truth, in Zanzibar, in East Africa, the people were enslaved on the islands, in both Pemba and in Unguja, the other island that constitutes Zanzibar. And there are sort of concerns around freedom today for African people who are being enslaved in modern day forms of slavery. So that's one area. On the other hand, I tend to want to remember that enslavement and slavery is not limited to people of African descent. The modern forms, for sure, like in the last 400 years, but even the etymology of the word slave goes back to Slav. Sure. So to sort of remember that it's nothing associated with our skin colors. It's nothing associated with our heritages, that this is a long history of humanity's oppression against other human beings. And so for me, the beauty of listening to lyrics about slavery is that it forces us to confront all forms of oppression today, while reflecting on the past, but really kind of critiquing our right here, right now, and exploring ways of sort of really growing freedom. So it reminds us of the urgency of freedom as something that we all ought to strive for and facilitate and collaborate to make sure that we bring it to everyday people's lives in all kinds of ways.
May I just add a follow-up and some points? I'm glad you mentioned East Africa, because it is important that people worldwide, and Africans both on continental Africa and outside, understand that before transatlantic enslavement, there was the Arab Islamic form that was actually lasted longer and was on a larger scale. And so not just some Zanzibari islands, but the transfer of people, forced transfer of people from south of the Sahara to societies in the north, across the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula and beyond, in gigantic numbers, bigger, I repeat, by all modern scholars agree that the system that I'm talking about, that second system to which Africans were subjected, was actually larger. So it's important that you mentioned it, and I'm just putting in that additional stuff. Now, I think it's important that we don't even appear to diminish the importance of the modern enslavement that we went through. And two ways where that happens that we need to be careful of. Europeans in the last decade or two have got into talking about modern slavery, and they're not in fact talking about slavery at all. What they've done is chuck together a whole series of illegal modes of oppression and given them the blanket category modern slavery, in part because they want to diminish the importance of the measure modern slavery experience, which is what they did to us. And that, I think, is the purpose of that actually idiotic and also negative, because what the modern slavery thing does in Britain is that it enables criminals, real ones, to say that they mustn't be prosecuted because they are subject to modern slavery. And if you raise that as a defense, it has to be fully investigated before they proceed with the trial. So that is something that we need to be aware of. And the other thing perhaps is that what happened to Africans in terms of enslavement, those two systems, is actually on a scale of enslavement that's unmatched anywhere in human history. People who don't know that need to just look at a book by Orlando Patterson, which is called Slavery and Social Death. But inside of that, he uses the available data to show the historical uniqueness of what in the modern period us Africans were subjected to, and stretching back to some centuries before that. What if we combine the two systems, no other peoples have been through that. So while it is true that enslavement is old, what Africans were subjected to by Arabs, one, from long before, and by Europeans. There's a famous African writer, continental novelist, who talks about the predators from the desert and the predators from the sea. And that predation is historically unprecedented. And we mustn't, as Africans, even imply that anything comparable has ever happened to any other people. And that includes what happened to the Jews in the Second War on a comparatively minor scale compared to us. Not that it's justifiable at all. But even the 6 million figure, if you take it as unquestioned, it's minuscule compared to what happened to us, sometimes with their involvement.
And then another thing that happened with slavery, enslavement of African people, their transportation, abduction and transportation to Europe, the Americas, and also the Caribbean, was that racism became attached to people of African descent. And we've seen the legacies of that enslavement, even in how in the police violence that is leading to the killing of people of African descent in the United States, and also to the violence even here in the UK, where if you look at prisons, you find that people of African Asian descent are overrepresented in prison. They are also underrepresented in anything that has anything to do with opportunities, overrepresented in disadvantages and discriminatory practices. Does reggae music speak to any of those issues to that multifaceted ways in which, not only slavery itself, but also its legacies impacts people of African descent?
It depends on what you mean by legacy. The truth of the matter is that we Africans have an encounter with the modern world, and the modern world is characterized by white power. And so we have an encounter with Europeans primarily. And when enslavement ends, and they take a long time ending it, the British say that they ended it out of their own goodwill and volition. There's no truth in that particular rumor. But when they ended it, what the British used, the claim about how they ended it to do, is to make a claim that having given up enslavement voluntarily, that fitted them to run a just empire, which is what they proceeded to do after they lost the American colonies and created the new British Empire. There's nothing humane, nothing civilized, nothing justifiable about it. And to use claims around abolitionism and present themselves as the abolitionists par excellence is not only idiotic, but actually a wicked ploy. It's idiotic because it's not in keeping with the historical facts, but it's wicked because it's a utilization of historical misrepresentation in the interest of the people who are doing it. So crucially, reggae doesn't necessarily spend a lot of time talking about us as being damaged, although the song that I cited by Anthony B, which is called Damage, that's the title of the song, and the words say, you don't have to say you're sorry for all the wrongs that you've done. We don't want to hear a sad story because the damage already done. And then he proceeds to talk about the nature of the damage and so on. Similarly, in another song of his, he did his best work about 10 years ago, and Anthony B, but it's extraordinary work. And he has another great and well-known song in which what he focuses on is the then current and actually still current structures of oppression in Jamaica. And so the Bundang Fire Upon Rome is a catalogue of the forms and leading names in the oppression, both in the political system and the economic system that is still in place in Jamaica. And Buju Banton, same generation, dancehall rather than reggae in some people's heads, but very specific analyses of what is happening. Buju has a song which is about police violence, in which he talks about people in a dance being raided by helicopters and how people have to hide their knives in red stripe beer bottles and right. It's very specific analysis of current social oppression or recent social oppression, and reggae does that a lot. In the UK, that generation of young men that started with Aswad, but include Mistine Roots and what's a famous Birmingham band called?
Steel Pulse.
Huh?
Steel Pulse.
Steel Pulse, yes. The work of all of those young men is about both Africa, which you correctly said, Brother Kwaku, but it's also about the specifics of oppression that Africans here in the UK are experiencing at the hands of the Babylonian system. Yeah, so that's what reggae does. It speaks to current conditions. It speaks to roots and modes of liberation, and it also speaks to love and freedom. There's a great song about, there's a land far, far away. There is a night, and on the day the King of Kings and Lords of Lords sit upon his throne and he rules. So, but it's an image of freedom tied up with getting away from Babylon and relocating, but it's not just going back to Africa. It's a grander conception of freedom than that. So we're in the presence of a really, really rich and specific and detailed mode of popular music, which is as powerful as it is for the reasons that I gave, but in addition to that, is as powerful as it is because of the specificity and correctness and power of the way in which it addresses past and current oppression.
Okay. Yeah, Ambrose, I want to come in, but I want to move from what Brother Cecil talked about because it's been quite expansive, but to tap a couple of things. Alex talked about modern artists, and probably it's shame on me, but to me, the only modern artist I can think of is Chronix. So you can see I'm stuck in my time warp in the late 70s to early 80s. But Chronix is an artist that I really, really, really admire. And I play his live video I can play it over and over and over and over again. But a song that speaks to what we're talking about is called Capture Land. And I think as I grow older, my ears get a bit deafer. So I'm not going to say I can always decipher the lyrics, but occasionally some lyrics jump up. And what jumped up to me when I was listening to Capture Land was he talked about thieving queen, so the Queen of England. He talks about the thieving King Ferdinand of Spain, and also Columbus. So I found that very interesting. Now I want to talk about slavery, enslavement. And then I'll come to language. I said slavery, so I'll come to language. Again, I want to develop a contrast to what Alex was talking about. The enslavement is not just physical, because if we look at our redemption song, Bob Marley is, a lot of people remember, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free ourselves. Those are one of the few lyrics I can quote. But what we failed to realize was that comes from Marcus Garvey.
Yes, it does.
And so it's about, we should also understand that enslavement should not only be focused on the physical, but also on the mental, because Africans are very much enslaved. Very much enslaved. Carter G. Woodson talked about the miseducation of the Negroes. We have an issue. The reason I'll further, maybe moving this discussion a bit further, is that the reason I'll tell you why Africa is not developed is that our leaders, that the political leaders, are so much enslaved. They are what I call European victimized. They've been victimized by European standards and they want to please the massa. So most of them are not Pan-Africanists. They might mouth it, including my own president, who's very great, because I've seen him in some Pan-African forums, and he says the right words and he bigs up Kwame Nkrumah, but on the ground, that's not what happens. So the mental slavery is what keeps us. So we should not always just talk about the physical one, which was brutal enough, but we're still bearing the legacy. Someone used the word legacy earlier on, of the enslavement in terms of our mentality. And now back to language. We must be mindful that I'm very particular about language. Instead of slavery, we talk about enslavement, because when you say enslavement, it changes a bit. Because when you say slave, you're assuming that that person was born a slave, that's always been their state. But when you say enslaved, then that's then there's an actor that's impacted on this person to become enslaved. So then you see that there's someone that's a slave, an enslaver. I was going to say slave master again. I don't like that master bit. So there was an enslaver. So it's not in isolation. Enslaved people are not in isolation to the people who've enslaved them. Then there's another word you use. Maybe if it comes, I'll just, African descent. I just did a submission to the Abelian, right? The UN working group experts on people of African descent. And I told them that I have an issue with that terminology, African descent, because not technically, all anthropologists, and that includes European anthropologists, agree that there's only one human race, and we all of African descent or African origin. So the European, the Asian is also of African descent. So I think the phraseology that are limited to people like this should be African heritage, because the European is not of African heritage like this, but we all as human beings of African descent or origin. So I'll beg your indulgence to maybe rephrase your terminology and talk about African heritage or simply Africans, I've got people from the Caribbean who said they're Africans who just happen to have been born in the Caribbean. So that's me for now.
Thank you.
Well, my use of people of African descent is to honor people of African descent by virtue of their ancestors coming from Africa. So while I agree that everybody's origins might be African, we know, to borrow from Peter Tosh, it doesn't matter where you come from, as long as you're a Black man, you're an African, kind of thing. So that's my only, so while I agree with you that we could say everybody is of African heritage, and that's fine by me.
No, not everybody's of African heritage. Everybody's of African origin or descent, not of African heritage.
Sure, but in the end, for me, that's because people are also free to identify themselves the way they want.
Could I make an input which may confuse?
I actually, if you allow me, I actually wanted to push on the actual point, the original question from Ambrose about how we grapple with contemporary forms of violence and racialization and racism in reggae music. And I wanted to highlight both Mutabaruka's This Poem, which speaks to, this poem shall speak about the people that came to the shores, talk about all kinds of things, and the poem outliving the poem itself. Sort of the long story, as Jamaicans say, the half has not been told. So sort of capturing the idea that there's so much to say and very little time to say it, so to speak. And then also highlight we were talking about Still Pulse, and Still Pulse's recent song, Don't Shoot, speaking to the contemporary forms of violence meted out by the police. And then one could go back to Linton Kwesi Johnson's Sonny's Letter, that speaks to the SAS laws in the UK, when they would convict you of the crime that you intended to commit, that you did not commit, and you'd actually be found guilty of it. Sort of to speak to the fact that reggae musicians and dub poets addressing these things in contemporary ways, and essentially speaking to the modern forms of abolition we are talking about, which is abolition of police violence and abolition of racialized policing, which is a legacy of that same old culture of demeaning and degrading people from Africa and Black people. So then, Cecil, you can go on.
Okay, it's a long story. I'm not sure what we gain from the distinction between African descent and African heritage. The problem that we face is that although it is absolutely true that there is only one humanity, there are racial divisions, and those racial divisions arose after we left Africa. That is to say, the last ice age, the Rum glaciation, is all in Diop and all over the place. That stuff makes it clear that the European as a type of humanity and Asians as a type of humanity emerged in the last no more than 30,000 years, and they're different, and the differences are to do with physical appearances, with the fact that in the conditions of the ice age, physical form change and so on. So all modern talk about race is talk about the physiological forms of humanity that have arisen in the last few tens of thousands of years, and Europeans in that sense are racially different from us, and we are in that sense racially different from East Asians and so on. So in a way, it doesn't matter that we're all of the same human race. The racism that we face is a function of the divisions that have come about within the single human species in the last few thousand years, and the way in which a part of humanity has armed itself militarily and technologically and exploited that military stroke technological advantage. And that is the problem that we presently face. Now, somebody said, and I don't remember who, that in a way, enslavement produced racism. It didn't actually. If you go and look at Europeans arriving in West Africa. It's documented. They have you know, Azarara's discovery of the discovery and conquest of Guinea. They talk about their own attitudes to themselves and to us at the point at which they arrive in West Africa in the 1440s and so on. We know what they thought. We know that there's racism already there. We know from other sources that Europeans were racist in Germany. Go and read the story of the Black Saint at Magdeburg, and you will see that even as they were making him a saint, because there's an advantage in to making him a saint in the conquest of the struggle against Islam, that racist, as in anti-Black, anti-African stuff was directed at him at that time contemporaneously. We also know that in the world in which we live, that South Asia starts off Black with people like us, sometimes with long hair, sometimes with short hair, but black skin. And we know that over a period of time, people with white skins migrated into that place and set up a system of racial color discrimination. That's what Hinduism effectively is. So racism, white racism against Black people isn't new, and we mustn't accept the, right, I'm hot on Marxism, but I don't think the Marxist account of the emergence of European racism as a product of capitalism is actually correct. And there's no good evidence for it. Everybody just says it and everybody believes it, but there's no evidence for it. And the contrary evidence is much more powerful than the non-existent evidence that they're using. Final point. The image of us being in mental slavery is a powerful one, and Marcus Garvey did use it. But the great thing about Marcus Garvey is that even though he mentioned mental slavery, he has a program for addressing it. Self-love, cooperation, liberation, organization, liberation practice. That's what he came up with in 1914, and that's what we still have to do. So the problem of our leadership in Africa isn't that they are in mental slavery. The problem is that instead of going for the Garvey and Nkrumah view of what should happen to Africa after the Second World War and the moment of independence, they opted for the European view because of their own politics, because they were in alliance with Western capitalism and so on. And that's a problem. Neocolonialism run by them on behalf of the white world is what rules and runs Africa now. It's not because they're crazy, although it's a mode of craziness. It's because of a political choice that they made in the 50s and 60s. Already when Nkrumah was directing them in the right direction, there was a majority in favor of the 1885 view of Africa: divide it up, use our borders, the borders that we've imposed on you, and don't bother with one Africa. And so as between China, one country, India, one country, and Africa, 50-odd countries, no wonder, you know, we're young, we're bright, and so on, but we're disadvantaged because we made the wrong decision in the 50s and 60s. And that's what we've got to address. It's not a mental health condition, it's a political choice.
Thank you. And before we come back to some of the issues that have been raised so far, is there anyone in the audience who would like to say something, ask a question? If you'd like to say, you know, if you raise your hand or unmute and just say what you want to say, that would be good. While people are thinking of their questions. Okay, so going back to what you were saying, Cecil, about the Marxist view on racism and capitalism and slavery, there is also this idea that a lot of the wealth that Europe and also the United States, the white world basically was built on the back of African people. what are your thoughts on that? And also, what are your thoughts with reference to reggae music?
That's almost beyond discussion. It's a fundamental truth. The only extent to which I disagree with it is that there's the odd person who says that there are no riches, nothing in Europe before they engaged in what they did after the middle of the 1400s, after the middle of the 15th century. As it happens, that's not true. And the reason it's not true is that there were working people here, just as there were in Africa, and the rich ones exploited the poor ones, and there were some minerals and so on. So it's not that the place was pauperized. It is that the transformation of wealth difference between us and them now is almost entirely a function of the way in which they exploited Native Americans, killed off those in North America, exploited the great empires of Central America and the South American continent, ripped off India, caused the starvation and death of millions in Africa, literally more than once, because they you know, it's a long story. And did terrible things also in China. Those are the processes by which they enrich themselves. And the documentation of that is all over the place. It's in Marx. People can go to the final chapters of Volume 1 of Capitalism and Slavery and see what Marx says about how capitalism made itself. They don't have to go to Marx. They can go to C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James has a wonderful essay in a book called Amistad I, long essay in there about how France was transformed into modern France on the basis of Haiti and so on. Eric Williams does the same for England, the United Kingdom, and so on. Walter Rodney also re-explores and deepens the exploration of that story. So there's no doubt whatsoever about the fact that, and even when they seem to be technologically successful, the British had to use taxation and violence to destroy Indian cotton industry, which is actually much, much more efficient than everything that was in Britain. And Lancashire succeeded not because it was efficient, but because the British government had control of India and taxed and controlled Indian cotton production into submission. And then turned to slave labor, enslaved labor in North America to supply them with cheap cotton, so that in addition to mashing up the Indian export trade, they could, you know, sell their allegedly efficiently produced cotton everywhere in the world. And that goes for almost everything else they did.
I don't know, Kwaku, Alex, if you want to come in.
The only thing I might add is that in the context of the United States of America, there is documentation that slave labor was the foundation of a lot of the wealth, the multi-generational wealth that you see today. Yes. And so to that extent, you could see how African free labor was the basis of the growing wealth. So recent discovery of the last ship that brought enslaved people to the US, Clotilda, and how that is associated with that particular family that sort of commissioned the building of the ship and brought in after the sort of the importation of enslaved people was already abolished in the US, and that family profited from that, and you could actually trace that wealth. So there are instances where you could see how African free labor became the foundation of sort of the of sort of building wealth among families, so within particular sort of subclasses of groups of people.
Yes, and you know, W. Du Bois is the first good source for describing the connection between the enrichment of, you know, making of European capitalism, sorry, American capitalism and African enslaved labor. We mustn't call it free labor, it's enslaved labor in that part of the world. And one other thing, you know, people tend to believe that Abraham Lincoln was this great liberator. He wasn't. Abraham Lincoln said that he'd settle for a union with Africans enslaved there with a partial enslavement or whatever. What he was committed to was the union, not the ending of enslavement. And the North was losing that battle before African Americans joined the Union Army against the slave South. And it's they who won that war for themselves and the whites. And in the period immediately after that, they were receiving some of the benefits. And what has happened in the United States of America is that there was a backlash run by the whites with control of individual states and also control of the government of the United States. All of the presidents have been racist in one form or another. Woodrow Wilson welcomed the birth of the nation racist film and so on and so forth. So it's important that we understand that North America, the United States of America, is no different from Britain or France or Holland in terms of where their wealth comes from. It's from the enslaved labor of our ancestors, and subsequently from the way in which people like the president of Ghana that got mentioned earlier have agreed to allow them to take our wealth in exchange for something that they call investment. And we need to understand, Walter Rodney taught us all we need to know about that what happens with direct capital investment is that they pretend to put money in and they take it back immediately via taxation policy and amortization. So within about 3 years, 5 at most, all investment is eaten up, and what happens in the process is that what we own becomes theirs, and they give us back a pittance that they might call whatever they call it, and we don't own anything. And it's even worse in Guyana at the moment. They're getting the Guyanese not just to allow them to pay themselves back for the investment in this alleged oil boom. What they're doing is putting the cost of their investment on the Guyanese people. And because Guyanese haven't bothered to learn the stuff that their best son, Walter Rodney, had made available to them, they believe that they're being enriched by, what were they, oxen? A terrible US multinational. As they say in the trade, I've landed.
Yeah. So noting that we've got 5 minutes left, maybe we as part of end notes, maybe if we talk about reparations and also reggae music and why, again, going back to why it is important for us to be talking about these issues, and why it is important that reggae music enables us, allows us to talk about these issues. And also, you know, where do we go from here?
Okay. May I jump in? I think obviously it's important that reggae talks about oppression and also about reparations. And I invite everybody to just go online and listen to Anthony B's song Damage, right? That's the least anybody can do, right? That's my first point. The second point, and Kwaku may be right, and that West African music is or has replaced reggae in the popular global African mind. And if it has, then it'd be very important that performers in that medium or that genre are actually singing about these issues. I know that Fela Kuti did and was, but whether the younger people are, I don't know. I stayed with reggae and dancehall through the 90s and into the early part of the 20th century and completely out of touch. So I don't know Chronicle, for example, that was mentioned earlier. I don't know his work at all. So function of age, function of generationality. Now, so what we need to do is not check out what our performers are doing, but to check on our own understanding of what is happening to us. And around reparations, the crucial thing to understand, in my view, and I spend a lot of time on reparations, I'm one of the only people in the world who's actually proposed a reparations movement around making Haiti get back what the French stole from them after enslavement and what the Americans stole from them during the 20th century invasion and occupation. We called it Haiti first, Haiti now. Some wicked people destroyed it, but right. So I'm 100% in touch with reparation. What's fundamentally happening is that the white states are all refusing. They say, it wasn't us, it wasn't you, it was legal at the time, it's out of date, it wasn't a crime against humanity, etc., etc. They got about 6 points, and they control the courts, and they say you go to court, and the judges rule on that basis, right? Even in the case of the Mau Mau reparations case, there were 2 cases, and the first one ended with the judge saying that no such case must successfully come before any British court ever again, right? So that closure has happened. Now, so that's how white power, hard power institutions, their states stand. Something else is happening, and they've turned on their soft power institutions, Church of England, Glasgow University, a few other universities, and some local authorities. The local authorities don't have any money, so you can ignore them. They pass nice resolutions, nothing going to come of it. So it doesn't matter what Bristol or whatever does. All of that is idiotic. What Glasgow, for example, and the Church of England, as good examples have done, is that they say, and you can't condemn them for doing it, we are going to calculate the benefits that we got from our involvement in enslaving your ancestors. Glasgow said, and I believe them, that they benefited to the tune of 200 million, right? Now, if you admitted to having benefited to the tune of 200 million, clearly that is what you have to give back. The Church of England last week did exactly the same thing. They have a wonderful report, I haven't read it yet, which makes a probably accurate assessment of how much they benefited. And then they're making a paltry offer. It looks like a lot of money, 100 million. It's peanuts in terms of what they themselves said they benefited, which is probably an underestimate. We Africans must know that that is happening, and we mustn't buy into this self-betrayal, because, right, somebody who I know, who's now the head of the University of the West Indies, somebody called Professor Beckles, who really should know better, has allowed himself to be tricked by Glasgow University into a scheme whereby they mention 20 million, which is 1/10 of what they say they benefit, the extent to which they say they benefited. And then they pull another trick. The 20 million isn't what they're giving back. The 20 million is what they say they are going to contribute part to, and they're going to help the University of the West Indies, or which other idiotic West Indian Caribbean institution agrees to work with them to raise, right? Now, we must be sensible enough, or this may be evidence of mental slavery, I don't know. But we must be sensible enough to see that we mustn't allow the white people to pull that kind of trick on us, which is exactly what is happening as we speak, right? So that's just part of the story about reparations. So a lot of people think that if you go out and run about and have things in the House of Commons or whatever, that, you know, this represents the route to reparations. What we've got to do is focus on where the power stands in this matter. Around reparations, there are 2 issues, power and morality. We tend to be impotent because of the world in which we live and the way where the power lies, and the white people don't have no morality. So those 2 things are operating against us. And what will change it? If the white people become moral, and somebody here can tell me how likely that is, right? So if the white people become moral, or if we liberate and empower ourselves so that we can say, we want back what you owe us. And Anthony B's song makes it clear, everything that they have is ours. I've ended.
Thank you, Cecil. And then Kwaku, Alex, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, and I will jump in just to add that in the UK, I think about 7 or so years ago, it was the Rastafari movement that initiated something called African Emancipation and Reparations March on 1st August. So ever since they started marching to 10 Downing Street, that's where the Prime Minister lives, to give in a petition. I think the last few years, particularly with COVID as well, they keep it around Brixton, which is in South London. So, I mean, they're part of a movement that is reawakening us to the demands for reparations. So I'll say, we started with music, and I said roots and culture very much driven by the Rastafari. And if you're looking at this reparations movement as well, in terms of certainly the march, it's been the Rastafari people that sort of like at least kickstarted it. Their role has changed a bit, but at least they kickstarted that. So it's always been part of their consciousness and what they wanted to do. The last now I'll say is that then we go to repatriation. Repatriation, and I think some people say it need not be physical, so it can be a mental thing, because certainly I don't think most of our diasporan Africans actually want to go to Africa. They're happy to sing about the idealized Africa and to know that it's somewhere that belongs to them, but they're not ready to go there physically. Some have gone, obviously. There are some in Ghana, Nigeria, Shashamaliland in Ethiopia, but most of us are comfortable. And that is not, what should I say, a criticism, but I'm saying most of us are comfortable in the West, and we're not ready to move to Africa anytime soon. So we must recognize that reality as well. That's me landed.
The only thing I could add is that I see reparations as multifaceted and multidimensional. So financial reparations are important and need to be explored. But other forms of reparations, including acknowledgement, including asking for forgiveness, including giving land and things like that, may also offer another avenue. Reggae music can serve a purpose of continuing to enlighten people, young, the old, or the people who may otherwise never encounter the language of reparation or the language of enslavement or the language of all forms of oppression. So reggae can play a role there. And can also serve as a bridge to build, because if we're hoping, as Brother Cecil was saying, that white people can be moral, I actually think some white people are moral. Not all white people are in the same boat, just like there are Black people who are heathen and terrible human beings. So I hope that music can also serve, like the Japanese who were part of the Rastafari movement in Jamaica that Brother Cecil talked about, that we could actually bring more people to be enlightened and to have a sense of humanity and a sense of respecting human dignity and human rights. So I'll end there, and thank you very much again for the time together.
Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you to everyone who attended. We were looking at what reggae music says about slavery, about enslavement, about abolition, and about reparations. And our speakers were Alex Otieno, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences at Arcadia University. We also had Cecil Gutzmore, who is a community activist and a historian whose activism combines Black revolutionary Pan-Africanism and left Marxian class positions, and has published widely in a number of journals and newspapers. and has also been looking at Marcus Garvey issues like Marcus Garvey in reggae, homophobia in Jamaican popular music and culture, and also Jamaican dancehall. And we've also had been hearing from Kwaku, who is a historical musicologist, author of the Brand Black Music History Project book and DVD. Kwaku is also UK convener of July 1 International Reggae Day, and June is British Black Music Month. So thank you once again, and hopefully see you next time.